My name is David Venegas, and I'm a product manager at Caparo. And the agenda that we have for today are the 5 trends of operational excellence, why continuous deployment is important. We're going to talk about DevOps, what is the typical DevOps toolchain, and how do we do DevOps with Caparo. So the first thing we're going to talk about are these 5 trends. These were presented by Matt Evans during Dreamforce. And what it talks about is how can your organization and enterprise companies become digital organizations. So the first item is product-aligned funding. Usually, and you may experience this in your companies, you plan projects, they might last 3 months, and then you release those projects if you're building an app, if you're building some community or some big functionality. Now, instead of saying, okay, marketing department, tell me what it is that you need and we're going to put it in a project. What the industry is moving towards to is having product owners. So in the marketing team, there's somebody that's going to own the marketing app and the marketing functionality. And then they're going to scope what it is that needs to be done in a small functionality. And then it doesn't need to wait 3 months to be released. It can be released in smaller amounts. So to be able to achieve that, that's something that will help you is the development and delivery. So you need to be able to have processes in place. For example, Agile, where you break big functionality or a big application into smaller pieces, where you can implement as well DevOps processes and continuous delivery, which we're going to talk more in the next minutes. Now, also as part of the trends to achieve this operational excellence is having an operating structure where the business IT teams are talking with the product managers, and so that you can create an enablement and communication, and that everybody is aligned and having tools that will automate different processes. So you want to be able to achieve that. Now also, it's important to have some guiding principles, some values. Everybody needs to understand what is the minimum excellence that everybody has to achieve as you're building new applications and new functionality. And also, what are the guidelines for decision making? What is important? Is the end user important? Is it something strategic? So those are some rules that need to be very clear. And the 5th point is strategy and governance. So that means reducing the risk, increasing compliance. So every time you release a new application, you want to make sure that there's no compliance issues being deployed to production. You want to make sure that all the users are accessing the right information. And you need to set a minimum set of standards of how this functionality is going to be tested and what does it mean that it's ready to be deployed into production or the live Salesforce org. So what are some of the common barriers to achieve this? Well, first of all, there's talent and skills gap. It may be that when you want to implement operational excellence, you might find there's a lot of tools that will enable you, but those tools require specific knowledge. So that's one of the barriers. Now, there's also legacy systems with data. And you might see this in some of the companies that you work with, that they have databases in other systems. And so when you are building a sales app or a marketing app that needs all that data, then you have a challenge because now you need to coordinate with the IT team to get all that data into your Salesforce application. And so that just gives you more time to have to work on these applications. Another one is that sometimes IT and business are not very well aligned. And so your team members might lose faith and be questioning the ability that this organization can become a digital organization. So that's another barrier. So why bother with continuous integrations? Well, because new features do not impact unless they're in production. In Salesforce, we have this motto or this phrase that if it's not in Salesforce, it doesn't exist. So the same applies for a feature or an app. If it's not in production, it doesn't exist because nobody's using it and nobody's tapping into the value of that new feature or that new application that you're building. Now, also, nowadays in this high competitive market that your companies are playing in, it's important to move fast. And so it's no longer acceptable that you have to wait 3 months, 6 months, 1 year to release a new application or a new functionality. You need to be able to move quickly. And it doesn't mean that you have to release a full application at once. You can break that into smaller pieces, just like the apps that you have on your phone. At the beginning, usually it's not going to be a full functionality, but over the time and over months, you're going to see smaller increases until it becomes a more powerful application. And also, your organization cannot consume all this change. Imagine you wait 3 months, 6 months, 1 year to release something. Well, the day of the release, you're going to notice, well, nobody knows how to use this thing. So now you need to get consultants, plan trainings with your team. So actually, even though the application is technically deployed to production, if people don't know how to use it, that means there's going to be another length of time that you need to wait. And all these are hidden costs because maybe you budget a project to be released, but you're not taking into account all the time that is lost by users understanding and knowing what to do. So why smaller changes are important? Well, because they are more predictable. Also because they're easier to verify and test. And also because it's easier for the entire organization to consume. So as you launch and continually deploy new features or enhancements, it's easier for employees and end users to be learning little by little in parallel as they do their sales job or they do their marketing job. So what is DevOps? DevOps is a set of practices that will automate processes that will enable your teams to achieve continuous deployment. Now, DevOps, what are the typical activities that happen? First of all, at the beginning, you have a planning stage where you gather requirements. You understand what it is that the end users need to enhance their productivity, to tap into new functionality. Then you go to the creating stage where the developers, the admins, they come into the developer sandbox, they start doing their applications or their fixes. Then once that functionality is built, you're going to go ahead and verify. You're going to do some testing. If there's code involved, you want to make sure that there's no bad practices introduced in the code. There's also, after that, there's also packaging. So you need to combine all the changes that all the admins, all the developers did, and you're going to go ahead and release it. You're going to deploy that to production and make it available to everybody. Now, at the end, you have configuration, where you modify user permissions, and then monitoring, where you track usage of your application. So the more you can have all this process automated, the better. So what does that mean in Salesforce? Well, in Salesforce, you usually have some developer sandboxes at the beginning. Then you have some integration and testing sandbox. And then you have the staging, and this is where the packaging happens. Right before production, you're going to combine all the changes and deploy them. So what you want to achieve on Salesforce is a repeatable and predictable process where there's multi-step approvals. So if you're building a functionality that includes some permission changes, you want to make sure somebody checks that those permissions are not giving access to data that users should not have. You should also be tracking what are all the changes that are happening, who's modifying which metadata, which layouts, which profiles, who's doing that, for what reason. And in each step of the way, you want to make sure that your quality standards are being met. So how does that look like? Well, how that looks like is when you implement different quality gates between each of the deployments of the sandboxes in your Salesforce. So that includes code reviews, automated Apex testing, static code analysis, regression testing, and compliance testing to make sure no permissions are given to the wrong people. Now, with that picture in mind of DevOps, this is something that whether you're using Caparo or you're not using Caparo or you're using any other company out there, that's something that you want to achieve, again, because we're moving in a fast, highly changing market. And so you want to make sure that you're always at right on the edge, because otherwise competitors can, if they're faster than you, they're going to catch up on you. So let's go ahead and see just a timeline, who we are, for those of you that don't know. We're originally a Spanish company. We're started in Madrid, and we had our first enterprise customer in the next year. That was Coca-Cola. And then we just started growing with some of the largest companies in the world that use Salesforce. They are also using Caparo. And in last year, we got an investment from Insight Ventures and Salesforce Ventures as well. Now that we're growing, we have offices in San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, London, and also Madrid. We have the product team that's focused here. So this is just to tell you that on a daily basis, we work with some of the biggest companies, solving a lot of challenges on what does it mean to achieve continuous deployment. So in the DevOps tool chain that we saw, where does Caparo fit in? Well, for the planning stage, it's usual that you have a Jira application or any other Agile application where you track business requirements. We also have an Agile piece, and we also integrate with other Agile applications like Jira as well. Now, for the creation, that just happens in your developer sandbox. You go into Salesforce, and then you create your functionality. For the packaging, we have the concept of artifacts, where we can split your functionality in sets of metadata and release them, and that's working with DX behind the scenes. For testing, we have integrations with Git repositories for tracking different versions of your metadata. And we have manual test scripts, Selenium testing, static code analysis, and also automated compliance. Now, for releasing, we deployed to different Salesforce orgs. So instead of having to use chainset, where you log into an org, create your chainset, and then deploy, you can actually just log into one org where you have Caparo installed and deploy between all your 10, 20, 30 sandboxes. And also, we have some configuration like data management, also permission set assignments, and anonymous scripts running in different orgs to do some configuration. So typically, in a DevOps toolchain, as we said, you have Jira or Azure at the beginning, then you code your changes and you commit them in your IDE and in a Git repository. Then you have Selenium for automated testing, and there's other tools as well. For packaging, you can use Maven, Gradle, and for releasing Jenkins, you use the Ant tool. And for configuration and monitoring, there's other applications. So what you're seeing here is just a bunch of applications. And at the beginning, we saw what are some of the barriers to success. That was the skills gap. So if you bring somebody into your company, and then you have to tell them, well, now you have to learn all these apps, then it's going to be overwhelming and it's going to take a long time. And then if that person leaves, then you need to bring somebody else and repeat the cycle. So what we wanted to achieve with Caparo was to reduce this. And for that, what our application covers are different pieces of the DevOps cycle. So that as you bring people, you can easily onboard them, because Caparo is on your Salesforce app org as an application, so it's point and click. Now, what does that mean? That means that we cover planning, testing, compliance, releasing, and monitoring. So for planning, what we have is an Agile application that you track user stories, and these can be imported directly from Jira as well. So we have Kanban boards, sprint walls, work manager. We have all this functionality, and if you use Jira, you can still keep using Jira. So this is just an optional piece that you have with Caparo. So the Caparo model, or how it works, is that you have different teams working in parallel. You can have different releases in parallel. And then it goes into the release management, Agile, and quality and compliance. So right now, let me show you how that looks like. So first of all, once you install Caparo, what you want to do at the beginning is connect all your different sandboxes and link them. You want to make sure you have a path where the development sandboxes are usually at the beginning, you have integration, then testing, and then production. And you can have some hotfix to deploy to production whenever there's an issue. Now, the way it works is that you have a user story. It was imported from Jira or other agile software, or you created it in Caparo. And as a developer or admin, I can see this user story, work on my sandbox, and then right from here, I can select what metadata I modified for this user story. It can be custom fields that you worked on, layouts, permissions, Apex classes. Now, this is just like a chain set, as you can see, but where it becomes more interesting is how do you, as a release management or organization, can you make sure that quality is being met? So for example, for this user story, I can go ahead and do a validation deployment here with this button, or I can run Apex test, or I can run static code analysis. So all these operations are happening behind the scenes in Heroku for this particular user story. So you can see this validation deployment, it completed with errors. So as an admin or developer, before I tell my release manager or my team lead, hey, my changes are ready, I already know they're not deployable. So I don't waste anybody else's time. I go ahead, check the errors, and fix the issues myself. The other thing is Apex code coverage. So right now I'm 87%, but the minimum is 75. So if I run Apex tests and the results are less than 75, I know I need to work on my code. And if I have any failing methods in this case, you can see that this user story is not meeting the standards of quality that my organization expects. And because we're a native app on Salesforce, you can set up custom validation rules and custom approval processes. So if I click on the submit for approval button, you can automatically check, okay, is the coverage above the minimum? Yes. Are there failing methods? Yes, there's one. So then this cannot go into approval, you need to fix it. And the same happens with validation deployments and also with static code analysis. So with static code analysis, we use PMD, the static code analysis application behind the scenes to check your code, and we also have integration with CodeScan. And what you get is a result of all the Apex classes and lines of code where there is an issue. For example, I have an SOQL inside a loop. This is an issue that's gonna affect the triggers of my organization. So if I do a data load, most surely it's gonna break, and then I'm gonna have to be data loading every 20 records at a time, which is gonna make me waste a lot of time. So as you improve the quality in your code, you can make sure that you can meet the quality standards and also avoid issues along the way. Now also in the user story level, I can have awareness if I can have a potential conflict, if somebody else is working on the same components that I'm working. So you can see that this class is also being worked on in 2 other user stories. One of them is already in production, but this one is in integration. So because behind the scenes, Caparo is using Git and version control to track your changes, I can do a pull request between my user story and the changes of the other user story that's in integration to see if we have a real conflict. And as well, in the user story, I can add an Apex script that will automatically assign some permissions in every org that this user story is going to be deployed to. I can also deploy some data records, and I can track manual tasks. There are things that you cannot automate. For example, if you need to go to another system connected to Salesforce, let's say SAP, you need to go there and do some manual clicks. Instead of having that on an Excel spreadsheet in a document somewhere outside of Salesforce, you can keep track of all that in the user story itself. So when you deploy this story, the release manager will see this task and it can have an owner. So it will notify the owner of the task so that the owner goes ahead and does it. So your deployment is actually stopped until this manual task is fulfilled. So as you deploy the user story, as you can see, it has moved from my developer org. It went to integration, now it's in testing. You can go ahead and with your QA team, you can make sure that this user story has been effectively testing and the functionality is working. And so all you need to do to deploy this is check a checkbox, and that's it. The user story is going to be deployed. Behind the scenes, Caparo is going to do the merging of version control, and it's going to deploy the merged changes into production. This means that the amount of conflicts or overriding, whenever I did some layout changes and then somebody deployed, and then my changes that I did are no longer there. So that's greatly reduced by Caparo using version control behind the scenes. So as you move your user stories upward, Caparo allows you also to back deploy user stories. So if I was working on a feature in Dev 1 and moved it to int, I will see this backward arrow in blue color. And then I can, as a release manager, I can deploy it down to all the sandboxes. This means that everybody that's working, every developer, every admin, will have the latest changes always. And behind the scenes, Caparo does a merge so that what you're working on doesn't get overwritten. And finally, this will arrive to production. So in this user story, this serves for audit purposes. Along the way, you can, at any point in time, you can come back to this record. You can see who worked on this user story, for what purpose, what were the specific metadata components that were modified, who tested this, what were the automated test results. So you can have all this information on Salesforce. So even, let's say in production you find there's a field or there's a class that's not working, you can simply search for the class. And you can see here's my trigger. So that's telling me in which user story this is found. So I can see who worked on it, what was the business requirement, why was somebody requesting this change. And then so this is the release management part when you deploy. But we also wanted to make sure our customers had some testing capability. So we have a testing application that's based on Selenium, and it has a recorder. So for example, I can record my business processes, what the sales people are doing on the front lines. You want to make sure that they're not interrupted. So as you deploy new features, you don't want to break their work. So with this recorder, I can go ahead and start recording. And in this case, I'm going to create a new account. So as I am typing, clicking, and selecting values, the recorder is building the test for me. So I'm going to go ahead and save. And if I go back to the recorder, you can see that I have the list of steps that I did, the clicks that I did. And so I can run this test in every sandbox that this user story is being deployed, so that I make sure that my business processes are not being broken. Also, so that is when you test on user story deployment, but you can also collect all these tests and run them every 6 hours on your production org, on your testing org as well. So once you have this test, the tests are saved on Salesforce as well. And when you run the test, you will get the test results from here, and you see the test script execution. If there was an error, you're going to have a screenshot, and there's always a video of the test execution as well. I'm not sure it looks that great, but this is just a CPQ testing, adding some quotes. So this is an automated testing that's running in a machine. We're using BrowserStack and Sauce Labs behind the scenes. So the test is asserting that I am able to add a quote, and I'm able to add products to the quote, and that process is not broken. So you run this every time without somebody having to manually test all the functionality that your salespeople are doing in the front line. So we talked about releasing, making sure all your changes are automatically tested. And now the one piece that we're missing is the compliance. how do you make sure that if you deploy a profile or a permission set, is not giving access to the wrong information, to the wrong people? So for that, we have the compliance application, where you create a set of rules. For example, in this case, I can set rules for profiles, permission sets, custom objects. I have an example here already open, where for a profile, I'm saying if a profile is not the admin profile, then they cannot have the view all data permission enabled. So if one day, let's say I'm a developer and in a sandbox, I'm creating a new profile, and by mistake, I check this checkbox. When I try to deploy the user story that contains this profile, because there is a rule that is against this action that I just did, it's actually going to stop my deployment, and it's going to create a finding on Salesforce, and it's going to say, hey, this checkbox is not allowed in other profiles other than the admin. So this way, I can go ahead and fix the issue right away. Because usually what happens, and you may experience this in your companies, is that you build great functionality, you deploy, everybody tests, everybody's happy, but then the compliance team or the security team comes right in before you're ready to release, and they say, hey, this release cannot be deployed, you need to fix this. So then this is also hindering your continuous deployment capabilities, because you don't want to have to detect that right before production. You want to make sure that that is detected at the beginning of your release process. And these compliance rules can be run directly in production, so that if somebody changed a permission right in production, you're able to detect that. So you can this can run every hour, every 6 hours, for example. And because we're a native application on Salesforce, we leverage the power of reports and dashboards. So you can be tracking all your testing, all your deployment activity, and all your compliance findings as well. So as you grow in complexity and you have more teams working in parallel, more projects, and more sandboxes, then Caparo scales to your needs. As you can see here, we have a large diagram. This is the average customer that we have. So by using version control behind the scenes, automated testing, automated compliance, we're able to enable customers to release their new functionality as fast as possible, but at the same time as reliable and predictable. Because you don't want to introduce errors in production, so that you have all these processes in place to avoid that. So what this means is that if you have all this automated, these are hidden costs. Every time there's a hindrance for your functionality to come out, your business is not tapping into that. We had an example of a customer that had a community portal that was selling a new product, and they had some issues before using Caparo, and they were telling us every day that that community was not being released, it was $10,000 of loss every day. So if you imagine, if it's 1 week, if it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it just amounts, and that was just that application. What if you start counting all the applications that just get stuck in a sandbox and not released? So you need to make sure that whichever tools you're using, whichever applications, you can reach an operational excellence where you have continuous deployment so that it enables your business to deliver value. And at the same time, you can maximize your return on investment on Salesforce, because Salesforce is there for you to build great functionality. So you want to make sure that you can deploy that functionality as fast and reliable as possible. Thank you very much. And we have any questions?
During our errors, how do you deal with conflicts?
So usually Git detects a lot of conflicts with XML, let's say objects, permission sets. We have an automated way to ignore or bypass those conflicts that are not real conflicts. It's just that Git doesn't understand XML structure. So that we do it automatically for you. Now, there's also other automatic conflict resolution capabilities. And at the same time, you can say, no, I want to resolve this manually. And so we have an online editor where you can resolve the conflict by yourself. And then we remember how you save your conflict. Let's say you were moving from a dev sandbox to integration. So we remember that we'll keep it in a hash. So wherever you deploy that user story, if we find the exact same conflict, we apply the same resolution that you did at the beginning. So you don't need to be resolving it every time. Yeah. Sure.
It's not clear for me when I am developing a user story and I have to configure it in Caparo. So it gets deployed or validated or whatever. So it's first that I put all the components that I have to work in my development in Caparo, and then it goes to Git and deployment, or I take some types that meanwhile I am developing, I upload to Git, and then it gets into Caparo.
Yeah, you can create, so behind the scenes when you select the components in a user story, Caparo creates a feature branch with the number of the story. So you can create that feature branch before Caparo creates it. You just need to make sure that the number of the story is in the name of the feature branch, so that then Caparo can identify it and say, okay, these are the components that were modified.
So I can be pushing to Git my development, and then if the feature branch has the same name, then it will download into the Caparo.
Yeah.
So I don't have to put manually all the components
into the user story. And for Dreamforce, we're working on a new CLI so that you can be able to commit, also to just do a lot of Caparo operations from your terminal as well. But for now, if you create the branch manually and commit, that already works. It's just we're going to be adding advanced functionality for example, the automated testing triggering the static code analysis, triggering the validation deployments right from your terminal. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Sure.
I'm sorry, we need to stop.
Yeah.
We can continue talking.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.